The seeds of speed, Normandy's hunger. Picture this. It's August 25th, 1944, 3 in the morning. Somewhere in the Norman countryside, a young sergeant from Detroit named William McBride sits behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton GMC truck, his hands cramped around the steering wheel. The headlights are taped over, showing only thin slits of light, just enough to follow the red cat's eyes of the truck ahead of him. Behind him, stretching back into the darkness for miles, hundreds more trucks crawl through the French night. Each one carries 5 tons of ammunition, gasoline, medical supplies, food, the lifeblood of an army that's moving faster than anyone ever imagined possible. McBride hasn't slept more than 4 hours in the past 3 days. His eyes burn, his back aches from the constant vibration of the truck, but he knows something that keeps him awake better than any cup of coffee. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, American tanks are running on fumes. Artillery batteries are down to their last shells. And if he doesn't make this run, if this endless convoy doesn't keep moving, the greatest military advance in modern history might simply stop. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. Not the sanitized version you might remember from textbooks, but the real story of how an improvised supply line became the circulatory system of liberation. How truck drivers, most of them African-American soldiers, given their first real chance to fight fascism with more than just their fists, created a logistical miracle that military planners still study today. But to understand why McBride and 40,000 other drivers were racing through the French countryside that summer, we need to go back 7 weeks, to the morning after D-Day, when Allied commanders first began to realize they had a problem they'd never anticipated. Success. The invasion of Normandy had been planned down to the last detail. Every beach gradient measured, every tidal chart memorized, every German strongpoint mapped and catalogued. But all that meticulous planning had been based on one fundamental assumption, that the advance inland would be slow, methodical, measured in hundreds of yards per day rather than miles. The planners had studied the terrain. The Norman bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. Each field was a potential fortress, each farm a strongpoint. Military wisdom suggested that breaking out of the beachhead would take months, not weeks. The supply plans reflected this assumption. A steady, predictable flow of materials from the artificial harbors at Omaha and Gold Beaches, moving inland at the pace of a careful, grinding advance. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25th, after weeks of brutal fighting in the hedgerows, General Omar Bradley unleashed the largest tactical air bombardment in military history. 2,400 heavy bombers and fighter bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on a rectangular patch of Norman countryside just 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. The German defensive line simply disappeared. General George Patton's Third Army poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. In 3 days, they advanced further than planners had expected them to move in 3 weeks. Suddenly, American tanks were racing across open French countryside at speeds that made staff officers back in London reach for their maps with trembling fingers. This was magnificent. This was what they'd dreamed of during all those months of preparation in England. But it was also terrifying, because armies don't run on courage and momentum alone. They run on gasoline and ammunition and spare parts and food. And every mile that Patton's tanks advanced took them further from the carefully planned supply depots back at the beaches. By early August, the mathematics of logistics were becoming brutal. A single armored division consumed roughly 300 tons of supplies per day. Gasoline alone. Each Sherman tank burned a gallon per mile, and Patton had hundreds of Shermans racing across France. Artillery batteries were firing more shells in a day than peacetime armies used in a year. And every mile forward meant longer supply lines, more vulnerable to interdiction, more difficult to maintain. The original plan had called for the rapid capture and repair of French ports. Cherbourg had fallen, yes, but the Germans had demolished it so thoroughly that it would be months before it could handle significant cargo. The artificial Mulberry harbors were engineering marvels, but they had limitations. Everything still had to be trucked inland from the Norman beaches, over roads that were never designed for this kind of traffic, through countryside where every bridge might be demolished, every crossroads might hide a German anti-tank gun. And there was another problem, one that the planners back in Washington and London had perhaps not fully grasped. The French people, liberated after 4 years of occupation, were greeting the Americans not just as soldiers, but as saviors. Every village wanted to celebrate. Every town square filled with crowds offering wine, flowers, kisses. It was beautiful, it was moving. It was also slowing down the supply convoys. Major General Frank Ross, the chief quartermaster of the European theatre, found himself facing a logistical nightmare that no amount of staff college training had prepared him for. His carefully planned supply system was designed for a methodical advance, not a breakout that was covering 50 miles a day. Traditional military logistics moved supplies through a series of depots, from the beaches to forward supply points, then to divisional dumps, then to regimental stockpiles. Each transfer took time. Each depot required guards, administrators, inventory clerks, but time was the one thing they didn't have. Every day of delay gave the Germans more opportunity to establish new defensive lines, to bring up reserves, to turn the liberation of France back into the grinding attrition that had characterized so much of this war. Ross needed something unprecedented, a supply system that could match the speed of Patton's advance, a logistics network that could stretch across hundreds of miles of uncertain territory and still deliver the goods. He needed a miracle. The solution, when it came, was both elegant and desperate. Forget the depots, forget the careful staging areas, forget everything the army had taught about proper supply procedures. Instead, create a highway, a dedicated road network where trucks would run continuously, day and night, from the beaches all the way to the front lines. No stops except for fuel and drivers, no transfers except at the very beginning and the very end. Just trucks moving in an endless stream, carrying the war forward on their backs. They called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing the name from the railroad term for high-priority freight. Red Ball meant urgent. Red Ball meant everything else gets out of the way. Red Ball meant that this cargo was so important that normal rules didn't apply, but creating this highway meant solving problems that no army had ever faced before. How do you coordinate thousands of trucks moving simultaneously across hundreds of miles of territory? How do you maintain vehicles that are running 20 hours a day over roads that were never designed for such traffic? How do you fuel trucks that are carrying fuel, feed drivers who are transporting food, repair vehicles loaded with spare parts? All while maintaining the speed that made the whole system necessary in the first place. And perhaps most challenging of all, where do you find the drivers? The infantry was busy fighting, the artillery was busy shooting, the engineers were busy building. Every military specialty was stretched to its limit. The only large pool of available manpower consisted of service troops. And in the segregated American Army of 1944, that meant primarily African American soldiers. Here was an irony that would have been bitter if it weren't so urgent. For months, black soldiers had been pleading for combat roles, for the chance to fight fascism directly rather than just loading supplies and digging latrines. The army had consistently refused, citing doubts about their courage under fire, their ability to handle complex equipment, their suitability for positions of responsibility. Now, suddenly, the success of the entire European campaign might depend on those same soldiers' ability to handle the most complex logistical operation in military history, to drive through hostile territory, to maintain vehicles under impossible conditions, to make split-second decisions that could affect the outcome of battles hundreds of miles away. The irony wasn't lost on the soldiers themselves. As one driver would later write home, they said we weren't good enough to fight the Germans. Turns out we're the only ones good enough to feed the fight. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially began operations. The first convoys rolled out from the beaches of Normandy, carrying supplies to Patton's Third Army, now racing toward the German border. It was, by any measure, a desperate gamble, an improvised solution to an unprecedented problem, a logistical experiment conducted under the most demanding conditions imaginable. But as Sergeant McBride shifted into gear that first night, as his truck joined the stream of red-lighted vehicles flowing inland through the darkness, something remarkable was beginning. Not just a supply line, but a transformation. Not just a highway, but a bridge, between the careful plans of peacetime and the brutal improvisations of war. between the segregated assumptions of American society and the integrated realities of American victory. The Red Ball Express was about to become the circulatory system of liberation, and the men who drove it were about to prove that when freedom itself is the cargo, no road is too long, no night too dark, no burden too heavy to bear. Gears and grit, the trucks and the men. The truck that would carry freedom had a name, though most of the men who drove it simply called it the Jimmy. The GMC CCKW353, 2.5 tons of cargo capacity, 6 wheels, and a heart made of Detroit steel. In the factories of Michigan, these machines had rolled off production lines at a rate of 1 every 7 minutes, destined for a war that would test every rivet, every gasket, every carefully engineered component. But specifications tell only part of the story. The Jimmy was more than its technical manual suggested. It was democracy on wheels, built by American workers, driven by American soldiers, carrying American ideals across the scarred landscape of occupied Europe. Each truck represented something profound, the industrial might of a nation that had transformed itself from isolationist observer to global liberator in less than 4 years. The cab sat high above the front axle, offering drivers a commanding view of the road ahead and of the dangers that lurked in every shadow. Canvas stretched over metal hoops protected the cargo bed from rain and shrapnel alike. The engine, a straight 6 that produced 104 horsepower, was designed not for speed but for reliability. Day after day, night after night, these machines would be asked to perform miracles of endurance. Behind the wheel of these mechanical marvels sat men whose stories had been largely written out of the official histories. Sergeant James Robinson from Alabama, who had learned to drive on his father's farm and could coax an extra 50 miles from an engine that should have quit hours earlier. Private First Class William Big Bill Thompson from Chicago, whose massive hands could change a tire in complete darkness while mortar rounds fell in the distance. Corporal Eddie Martinez from Texas, who spoke 3 languages and became the unofficial translator for convoys moving through liberated villages. These were the unsung heroes of the Red Ball Express, men who had volunteered to serve a country that had not always served them well in return. Most were African-American soldiers, members of the 3rd Truck Transportation Battalion, the 514th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, and dozens of other units whose designations masked their critical importance. They had been deemed unsuitable for combat roles by a military hierarchy that questioned their courage. Yet here they were, driving through combat zones with nothing but canvas and determination for protection. The irony was not lost on them. While white combat units received the headlines and the glory, these men carried the bullets, the bandages, the gasoline, and the hope that kept those same units fighting. Without recognition, without fanfare, often without adequate rest, they became the invisible lifeline of liberation. Sergeant Robinson remembered his first convoy briefing at a depot outside Cherbourg. The commanding officer, a white colonel from Virginia, had addressed the assembled drivers with barely concealed skepticism. "You men have been given a job," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional doubt. "I hope you understand the responsibility." Robinson had wanted to respond that they understood responsibility better than most, that they had been carrying the weight of others' expectations their entire lives. The trucks themselves became extensions of their drivers' personalities. Some Jimmies bore hand-painted names on their bumpers: Sweet Caroline, Detroit Special, Freedom's Chariot. Others carried more pointed messages, subtle protests against the segregation that followed them even into the theater of war. Democracy Express read one bumper, the word democracy underlined twice in white paint. Maintenance was both science and art. These men learned to diagnose engine problems by sound, to identify transmission issues by feel, to predict tire failures by instinct. In the field, spare parts were precious commodities. A broken fan belt might be replaced with strips of canvas. A cracked radiator hose could be patched with electrical tape and prayer. The official maintenance manual called for specific procedures and genuine parts, but war demanded improvisation. Private Thompson had developed an almost mystical relationship with his assigned Jimmy. He could tell by the sound of the engine whether the carburetor needed adjustment. He knew exactly how much play the steering wheel could have before the front end required attention. His truck had carried ammunition to Patton's tanks, medical supplies to field hospitals, and mail to homesick soldiers, never missing a delivery, never breaking down at a critical moment. But the machines were only as strong as the men who drove them, and those men faced challenges that went far beyond mechanical failure. The roads of France in late summer 1944 were obstacle courses of destruction. Bomb craters, abandoned vehicles, and hastily repaired bridges created hazards at every turn. German aircraft, though increasingly rare, still posed a constant threat. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to target supply convoys, understanding that destroying a truck full of ammunition could be as valuable as shooting down a fighter plane. More insidious than enemy action was the discrimination that followed these men even into the war zone. At some supply depots, African-American drivers were forced to wait hours for loading, while white units were served immediately. Rest areas were often segregated, forcing tired drivers to sleep in their cabs while others enjoyed proper facilities. The Red Cross, that symbol of humanitarian care, operated separate facilities based on race, even in the midst of humanity's greatest struggle for freedom. Corporal Martinez had witnessed the absurdity firsthand. After driving for 18 straight hours to deliver critical supplies to a frontline unit, he had been refused service at a Red Cross canteen, while German prisoners of war, classified as white, were welcomed inside. The contradiction was stark and painful. Men who risked their lives for American victory were treated as second-class citizens by American institutions. Yet they persevered, not because the system was fair, but because the mission was just. They understood, perhaps better than their commanders, that the cargo they carried represented more than military supplies. Each crate of ammunition, each case of medical equipment, each bag of mail carried the promise of a better world. A world where the democracy they were fighting to preserve might finally extend to all its citizens. The Jimmy trucks rolled on through the French countryside, their engines humming a mechanical hymn of determination. In the gathering dusk of late summer, their headlights created moving constellations of hope, guided by men whose courage had never been questioned by those who mattered most. The soldiers who depended on their deliveries, the civilians who saw in their passing the promise of liberation, and the enemy who learned to fear the steady rumble of American logistics. These were the gears and the grit of victory. The trucks that carried freedom and the men who proved that heroism comes in many forms. Not all heroes charge enemy positions with rifles blazing. Some drive through the night with headlights dimmed, carrying the tools of liberation to those who would wield them in the final push toward peace. The Red Ball Express was finding its rhythm. A steady, determined beat that would echo across Europe for months to come. The Jimmies and their drivers had become something unprecedented. A supply line that moved not just materials, but hope itself, mile by grinding mile toward the heart of a crumbling Reich. And night riders, the rhythm of the road. By 10 o'clock on most evenings, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hedgerows of Normandy, the real work of the Red Ball Express began. The daytime convoys had been impressive enough, hundreds of trucks stretching across the French countryside like mechanical ants carrying their vital cargo. But the night runs, these were different. These were when the Express truly lived up to its name. The darkness transformed everything. What had been a challenging but manageable operation in daylight became something far more complex, more dangerous, more lonely. The drivers who volunteered for these night shifts knew they were taking on additional risks. Enemy aircraft still prowled the skies, looking for exactly these kinds of targets. Saboteurs and remnant German units remained scattered throughout the countryside, particularly in the dense forests of the Ardennes. And then there were the simple hazards of driving heavily loaded vehicles at speed through unfamiliar territory, on roads that had been bombed, shelled, and hastily repaired. But the night runs were essential. The mathematics of supply were unforgiving. During daylight hours, the Red Ball Express could move perhaps 60% of what the advancing armies required. The remaining 40%, that had to travel under cover of darkness. Ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement parts, all the countless items that modern warfare consumed at an almost incomprehensible rate. Sergeant William Big Bill Johnson from Detroit had become something of a legend among the night drivers. At 6 feet 4 inches and 250 pounds, he barely fit in the cab of his Jimmy. But he had an almost supernatural ability to navigate in complete darkness. Other drivers would follow his taillights through the most treacherous stretches, trusting his instincts more than their own eyes. On this particular night in early September, Big Bill was leading a convoy of 37 trucks through the rolling hills south of Rams. The cargo was mixed: cases of rifle ammunition, jerry cans of gasoline, medical supplies for a field hospital, and several crates marked only with cryptic military designations that the drivers had learned not to ask about. The total weight of the convoy exceeded 400 tons. 400 tons of American industrial might rolling through the French countryside at 35 miles per hour. The sound was hypnotic. 37 GMC engines, all slightly out of sync, created a deep, rhythmic drone that seemed to merge with the landscape itself. The drivers had learned to read these sounds like a language. A slight change in pitch might indicate engine trouble. A gap in the rhythm meant someone was falling behind. The occasional backfire, sharp as a rifle shot in the darkness, would cause everyone's pulse to spike for a moment before they remembered it was just an engine running rich. Big Bill kept his headlights on the dimmest setting, just barely illuminating the road ahead. The other drivers maintained proper blackout intervals, close enough to follow, far enough apart to avoid catastrophic collisions if the lead vehicle had to stop suddenly. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant attention and considerable skill. The French countryside at night held its own particular beauty, even in wartime. Ancient stone farmhouses sat dark and silent, their inhabitants long since evacuated or hiding in cellars. Orchards heavy with autumn fruit lined the roads, filling the air with the sweet scent of apples and pears. In the distance, the occasional flash of artillery illuminated the horizon, a reminder that somewhere ahead men were still fighting and dying, but mostly there was just the darkness and the steady rhythm of the convoy. Mile after mile, hour after hour, the trucks pressed forward. The drivers fought fatigue with coffee, when they could get it, cigarettes, and constant vigilance. Many had developed their own rituals to stay alert. Some sang quietly to themselves, others recited prayers or poetry. A few had learned enough French to practice conversations with imaginary locals. Private Tommy Washington from Birmingham had a different approach. He told himself stories, elaborate tales about what he would do after the war. Tonight, as his Jimmy rolled through a village that had been abandoned since the initial German retreat, he was imagining the garage he would open back home. He had it all planned out: the location, the equipment he would need, even the sign he would paint above the door. Washington's Auto Repair. We fix what others can't. These dreams weren't just idle fantasy, they were survival mechanisms. The loneliness of the night runs could be overwhelming. Hours of darkness, with nothing but the road ahead and the weight of responsibility behind. These men were carrying the tools of war to their brothers in arms, and they knew that any delay, any mistake, could cost lives at the front. The radio chatter was minimal. Too much communication could give away their position to enemy listeners. But occasionally, brief exchanges crackled through the static. Checkpoint Charlie to Big Bill, all clear ahead. Roger, Charlie. Convoy rolling steady. These brief contacts were lifelines, reminders that they weren't entirely alone in the vast darkness. Around midnight, the convoy approached one of the most dangerous sections of the route. A stretch of road that ran through dense forest, where the trees pressed close on both sides and created perfect ambush conditions. Intelligence reports suggested the area had been cleared of enemy forces, but intelligence reports had been wrong before. Big Bill slowed the convoy slightly and increased the intervals between vehicles. If there was going to be trouble, this was where it would happen. The forest was eerily quiet. Even the engine noise seemed muffled by the thick canopy of leaves overhead. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, a sound so normal, so peaceful that it seemed to belong to a different world entirely. But they made it through without incident. As the trees gave way to open farmland once again, the collective tension of the convoy eased slightly. Radio discipline relaxed just enough for a few brief exchanges. Nice and easy, boys. Nice and easy. The rhythm of the engines settled back into its steady, hypnotic drone. By 3 in the morning, they were approaching the forward supply depot, their destination for this run. The depot was a marvel of military efficiency. acres of carefully organized supplies, all protected by camouflage netting and defended by strategically placed anti-aircraft guns. Even in the darkness, the depot hummed with activity. Crews of soldiers worked around the clock to sort, inventory, and redistribute the constant stream of supplies flowing from the beaches of Normandy to the advancing front lines. The unloading process was swift and professional. Each truck pulled up to its designated area, where waiting crews immediately began transferring cargo. The drivers helped when they could, but mostly they took advantage of the brief respite to stretch their legs, grab a quick meal, and prepare for the return journey. The return trip was always different. The trucks were empty now, riding higher and handling differently. The immediate pressure was off. They had successfully delivered their cargo. But the roads were just as dangerous, the night just as dark, and the journey just as long. Some convoys made the return trip immediately, pushing through until dawn. Others waited until the next evening, giving the drivers a chance to rest. Big Bill's convoy was scheduled for immediate return. They would be back at the supply depot in Normandy by sunrise, ready to reload and begin the cycle again. As they rolled through the pre-dawn darkness, the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of light. Soon, the night shift would end and the day convoys would take over. But for now, in these quiet hours before dawn, the Red Ball Express belonged to the night riders. The men who had learned to navigate by starlight and intuition, who carried the weight of war through the darkness with nothing but determination and the steady rhythm of their engines to guide them. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness like a promise. Mile by mile, hour by hour, the Red Ball Express continued its vital mission, a lifeline of steel and determination connecting the industrial might of America to the battlefields of Europe. And in the cabs of those rumbling jimmies, men like Big Bill Johnson and Tommy Washington pressed forward through the night, carrying not just supplies, but hope itself, toward whatever tomorrow might bring. Sparks and shadows, repairs and resilience. But the promise of dawn brought its own challenges. As the first pale light crept across the French countryside, it revealed what the darkness had mercifully hidden. Trucks scattered along the roadside like wounded animals, their engines silent, their drivers gathered in small groups around open hoods and steaming radiators. The Red Ball Express, for all its determination and careful planning, faced an enemy that no amount of courage could defeat: mechanical failure. The statistics were sobering. On any given day, nearly 30% of the convoy's vehicles would break down. These weren't just minor hiccups. These were catastrophic failures that could strand tons of vital supplies miles from their destination. Private James Wrench Williams understood this reality better than most. A former Detroit auto worker turned Army mechanic, he had watched the Red Ball Express evolve from ambitious concept to desperate necessity. Now, as he knelt beside a disabled Jimmy on a muddy road outside Chartres, he could read the symptoms like a doctor examining a patient. Transmissions shot, he called out to the driver, Corporal Martinez, who sat on the running board with his head in his hands. Third one this week on this same route. The problem wasn't just wear and tear, though there was plenty of that. These trucks were being pushed far beyond their design limits. GMC had engineered the CCKW for military durability, but even they hadn't anticipated the relentless punishment of the Red Ball Express. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, over roads that were often little more than glorified cart paths. It was a recipe for mechanical disaster. Williams opened his field toolkit, a collection of salvaged parts, improvised tools, and hard-won experience. The Army's official maintenance manual assumed access to proper facilities, replacement parts, and time. Luxuries the Red Ball Express couldn't afford. Out here, repairs meant creativity. "Hand me that piece of wire from the fence post," Williams instructed Martinez, "and see if you can find a tin can, something about the size of a C-ration container." This was battlefield engineering at its finest. Williams had learned to fashion clutch plates from scrap metal, create gaskets from leather boots, and jury-rig electrical systems with telephone wire liberated from abandoned German positions. Every successful repair added to an informal knowledge base shared among the mechanics through whispered conversations during brief rest stops. The camaraderie born from these roadside emergencies created bonds that transcended the Army's rigid hierarchy. When Sergeant Thompson's truck threw a rod bearing outside Reims, It wasn't just his problem. It became everyone's problem. Drivers who should have been sleeping after 18-hour shifts instead gathered around the disabled vehicle, offering tools, parts cannibalized from their own trucks, and most importantly, their time. "We leave no truck behind" became their unofficial motto, though it never appeared in any official documentation. This wasn't just military efficiency. It was survival. Every disabled vehicle meant supplies that wouldn't reach the front lines, ammunition that wouldn't reach the infantry, fuel that wouldn't reach the tanks pushing toward Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Mack McPherson had developed a system for these crisis moments. A former railroad mechanic from Chicago, he understood that logistics wasn't just about moving things from point A to point B. It was about maintaining the entire system under impossible conditions. Priority 1, he would tell his crews, get the medical supplies moving. Priority 2, ammunition. Everything else we figure out as we go. But Mac's real genius lay in his ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. He noticed that certain truck models failed more frequently on specific road segments. He tracked which drivers were hardest on their equipment and which ones seemed to coax extra miles from aging engines. Most importantly, he began positioning his best mechanics at strategic points along the route, not waiting for breakdowns to happen, but anticipating where they would occur. The French civilians, initially wary of these convoys thundering through their recovering villages, gradually became unofficial allies in this repair network. Farmers would appear with buckets of water for overheated radiators. Village blacksmiths offered their forges for emergency metalwork. Children learned to recognize the sound of a failing engine and would run to alert the nearest mechanic. Marie Dubois, whose farm sat along a particularly treacherous stretch of road near Soissons, kept a pot of coffee perpetually brewing for the American mechanics who seemed to work miracles with nothing but determination and scrap metal. She watched Williams transform a broken transmission into a functional one using parts from 3 different wrecked vehicles, German and American alike. "Comment est possible?" she asked in wonder. "How is this possible?" Williams looked up from his work, grease streaking his face, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Ma'am," he said in his careful textbook French, "when you're fighting for something that matters, you find a way." The repair crews worked in shifts, following the convoys like battlefield medics following infantry advances. They established informal supply depots in abandoned barns and bombed-out buildings, stockpiling salvaged parts and improvised tools. A broken German staff car might donate its generator to a Jimmy with electrical problems. A destroyed American tank could provide heavy-duty springs for overloaded trucks. As the weeks passed, these mechanics developed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems by sound alone. The particular wheeze of a failing water pump, the rhythmic knock of worn bearings, the grinding protest of an overloaded differential. They could hear trouble coming from miles away and position themselves accordingly. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to repair more than just machines. When Private Johnson broke down in tears after his 3rd truck failure in 2 days, it was Wrench Williams who sat beside him in the darkness, sharing a cigarette and quiet words of encouragement. When Corporal Davis received news that his brother had been killed in the Pacific, the entire repair crew took over his maintenance duties without being asked, allowing him the space to grieve while ensuring the mission continued. The Red Ball Express had become more than a supply line. It was a community held together by shared purpose and mutual dependence. Every successful repair was a small victory against the chaos of war. Every truck that rolled again was proof that ingenuity and determination could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. In the growing light of another French dawn, Williams finally coaxed life back into Martinez's transmission. The engine turned over, caught, and settled into a steady rumble. Another small miracle. Another day the lifeline would continue. Whispers of gratitude, a village's welcome. The rumble of Martinez's truck joining the convoy was more than mechanical sound. It was a note of hope that carried forward into the French countryside. As the Red Ball Express wound through villages that had tasted both occupation and liberation, the drivers began to understand they were witnessing something profound. Communities learning to breathe again. The village of Sainte-Mère-Église had already seen its share of history. Paratroopers had dropped from the night sky just months before, And now these American supply trucks brought a different kind of salvation. As Big Bill Johnson downshifted his GMC through the narrow main street, he noticed how the morning light caught the patched roof tiles. Evidence of recent repairs, of people rebuilding their lives one beam at a time. An elderly woman emerged from a stone cottage, her weathered hands clutching a small bundle. She approached Johnson's idling truck with the careful dignity of someone who had survived too much to waste gestures on anything but truth. Without words, she pressed the bundle into his hands through the open window. Fresh bread, still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth that smelled of lavender and hope. "Merci," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Merci beaucoup." Johnson felt the weight of more than bread in his hands. This was gratitude made tangible. A communion between strangers bound by the simple understanding that freedom required countless small acts of courage. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and carefully placed the precious bundle beside him on the worn bench seat. These moments of connection became the hidden currency of the Red Ball Express. In village after village, the pattern repeated with infinite variations. A cup of ersatz coffee shared at dawn, children waving from doorways with the fierce joy of those who had learned not to take tomorrow for granted. Farmers pausing in their fields to raise weathered hands in salute to the passing convoys. Corporal James Washington discovered this truth in the village of Bayeux, where his truck developed a persistent radiator leak. As he worked beneath the hood, steam rising around his hands, a young French mechanic appeared with tools and expertise. Together, without sharing a common language beyond the universal vocabulary of mechanical necessity, they diagnosed the problem, a hairline crack that could be sealed with the right touch and a bit of ingenuity. The French mechanic, introduced through gestures as Henri, had maintained German vehicles under duress for 4 long years. Now his skilled hands worked to keep American trucks rolling toward victory. The irony was not lost on either man. How war could transform enemies into allies, strangers into brothers, all through the simple act of shared purpose. As they worked, Henri's wife brought them bowls of thin but nourishing soup, vegetables from their small garden, seasoned with herbs that had somehow survived the occupation. Washington savored each spoonful, understanding that he was tasting not just food, but resilience itself. The quiet determination of people who had refused to let darkness extinguish their humanity. The children were perhaps the most remarkable witnesses to these exchanges. In the village of Carentan, a group of young boys had appointed themselves unofficial guides for the American drivers. They knew which streets could accommodate the large trucks, where fresh water could be found, which routes avoided the worst of the rubble from recent fighting. 8-year-old Pierre had lost his father to the resistance, yet he greeted each convoy with undiminished enthusiasm. He had learned enough English to serve as translator, his high voice carrying between French villagers and American soldiers with the easy confidence of the very young. When Sergeant Martinez offered him a piece of chocolate from his K rations, Pierre carefully broke it in half, sharing with his younger sister, who watched shyly from behind their mother's worn skirt. These children had grown up too quickly, their games interrupted by war, their innocence tested by occupation. Yet they retained something essential, a capacity for wonder that reminded the drivers why they endured the sleepless nights and mechanical failures. Freedom was not an abstract concept when you saw it reflected in a child's unguarded smile. The village churches served as unofficial rest stops, their ancient stones offering both practical shelter, gear, and spiritual respite. In these sacred spaces, drivers found themselves in quiet conversation with local priests who spoke of hope in multiple languages: French, Latin, and the universal tongue of shared humanity. Father Dubois in the village of Issigny had hidden resistance fighters in his bell tower, sheltered Jewish families in his cellar, and maintained faith through the darkest hours of occupation. Now he offered what comfort he could to these American soldiers, blessing their vehicles, sharing what little wine remained from pre-war vintages, and reminding them through his very presence that some things endured beyond the reach of armies. The sensory memories of these village encounters would stay with the drivers long after the war ended. The smell of wood smoke from cottage chimneys, the sound of church bells marking time in communities learning to celebrate again, the sight of laundry hanging on lines, a simple declaration that normal life would resume. These were the moments that transformed duty into something deeper. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a bridge between peoples, a demonstration that liberation meant not just military victory, but the restoration of human connection. Every successful delivery carried with it the gratitude of these French villages, the weight of their hopes made manifest in tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. As the convoys rolled on toward the front lines, they carried more than material cargo. They bore the prayers of village priests, the tears of grateful mothers, the laughter of children discovering joy again. All the whispered gratitude of a people learning to believe in tomorrow. The flow of war, depots and deliveries. The gratitude followed them forward, but it was at the massive supply depots where the true magnitude of this operation revealed itself. Here, in sprawling complexes that had materialized seemingly overnight in Norman fields, the Red Ball Express transformed from individual acts of courage into something approaching industrial miracle. Picture, if you will, the depot at Cherbourg as dawn breaks over endless rows of supplies. Mountains of wooden crates stacked 20 feet high, their stenciled markings creating geometric patterns against the pale morning sky. Rations by the tens of thousands. Medical supplies in pristine white boxes marked with red crosses. Ammunition crates bearing warnings in multiple languages, their contents deadly serious, yet somehow peaceful in their orderly arrangement. The scale defied comprehension. Each day these depots processed tonnage that would have supplied entire armies in previous wars. Yet here it represented merely the daily requirement to keep a single advancing front moving forward. The numbers told their own story. 15,000 tons of supplies flowing through Cherbourg Depot alone on a typical August day. Enough fuel to fill an Olympic swimming pool. Enough ammunition to level a city, yet destined instead to liberate one. But numbers, however staggering, could not capture the human choreography that made this possible. Watch the loading crews as they work. African-American soldiers moving with practiced efficiency, their movements synchronized through weeks of repetition, each man knowing his role in a dance of logistics that never paused, never faltered. Sergeant Willie "Smooth" Jackson orchestrates the loading of his convoy with the precision of a conductor. His crews have perfected their rhythm. 2 men on each side of the truck, lifting in unison, calling out the count. 1, 2, heave. The weight distributed, the balance maintained, the cargo secured with rope and canvas in patterns that have become second nature. The depot itself pulses with constant motion. Forklifts weave between the supply mountains, their operators navigating paths that shift hourly as new deliveries arrive and old stock depletes. The sound is hypnotic. The rumble of diesel engines, the scrape of wooden crates against truck beds, the rhythmic thump of boots on wooden loading ramps. French stevedores work alongside American soldiers, their expertise in handling cargo proving invaluable. Language barriers dissolve in the shared understanding of weight, balance, and secure loading. A gesture, a nod, a quick demonstration. Communication flowing as smoothly as the supplies themselves. The organization required was staggering in its complexity. Each truck received a manifest listing every item in its cargo bay. Destinations coded by number and priority. Routes calculated to the minute. Fuel allocations precise to the gallon. Nothing left to chance, yet everything dependent on human judgment and adaptation. Supply officers moved through the depot like chess masters contemplating their next moves. Major Patricia Williams, one of the few women in logistics command, tracked supplies with an almost mystical intuition. She could predict shortages before they materialized, sense bottlenecks in the flow before they formed. Her clipboard held the fate of entire divisions, medical supplies for the wounded, ammunition for the next offensive, fuel for the tanks that would break through German lines. The depot operated around the clock, its rhythm shifting but never stopping. Day crews handled the bulk loading, their work visible and methodical. But the night shift possessed a different energy. More urgent, more focused. These were the supplies for emergency runs, the critical shortages that could not wait for dawn. Watch as night falls over the depot. Floodlights illuminate the work areas in harsh white pools, creating islands of activity in the darkness. The sounds become more intimate, more personal, individual voices calling out instructions. The squeak of rope being pulled tight, the gentle thud of canvas being secured over precious cargo. The trucks arrive empty and leave transformed, each vehicle becoming a mobile lifeline, its cargo carefully selected and positioned for maximum efficiency. Heavy items on the bottom, fragile supplies cushioned and protected, fuel barrels secured with extra care. Every load balanced not just for weight distribution, but for the realities of the road ahead. The potholes that could jar loose improperly secured cargo. The sharp turns that tested even the best loading job. Between the loading bays, small dramas played out continuously. A driver discovering damage to his regular truck, quickly reassigned to another vehicle. A last-minute addition to a cargo manifest, requiring rapid reorganization of an entire load. A mechanical failure discovered during pre-trip inspection, sending crews scrambling to transfer cargo to a replacement truck. Yet somehow, the flow never stopped. Like water finding its way around obstacles, the operation adapted and continued. Backup plans activated seamlessly. Alternative routes calculated instantly. The great machine of supply grinding forward with relentless determination. The depot represented more than mere efficiency. It embodied the transformation of American industrial might into military victory. Here, the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the farms of Iowa and Kansas, the refineries of Texas and Louisiana all converged into a single purpose. Democracy made manifest in tons of supplies, freedom measured in successful deliveries. As each loaded convoy departed into the night, it carried with it the concentrated effort of an entire nation. The depot workers watched them go, already turning their attention to the next trucks in line, the next loads to be assembled, the endless flow of war made possible by their steady, tireless work. Fading footsteps, scaling down and disbandment. But even as the depot workers maintained their relentless pace through September of 1944, change was already stirring in the autumn air. The port of Antwerp, captured but not yet fully operational, promised to revolutionize Allied logistics once its approaches were cleared of German mines and fortifications. Military planners were quietly drafting new supply routes, shorter, more efficient lines that would bypass the grueling highway runs from Normandy. The Red Ball Express drivers sensed it first in small details: fewer urgent radio calls in the middle of the night, slightly longer intervals between convoy departures, maintenance schedules that allowed for more thorough repairs rather than the desperate patch-and-go work that had defined their summer months. The frantic edge that had driven every decision since August was beginning to soften. Sergeant Big Bill Johnson noticed it during a routine run to Verdun in early October. The loading process at the depot moved with the same practiced efficiency, but without the barely controlled chaos of earlier months. Supply officers consulted their clipboards with deliberate care rather than frantic urgency. Even the French villagers seemed different, less desperate in their gratitude, more settled in their liberation. "Feels like the war's moving away from us," observed Private Tommy Washington as he checked his cargo straps one evening. His words carried a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. For months, these men had lived at the absolute center of the Allied war effort. Every mile they drove, every delivery they completed, had immediate tactical significance. Now, gradually, that centrality was shifting eastward with the advancing armies. The first official indication came in mid-October. Selected drivers were reassigned to other transportation companies. Certain routes were consolidated or eliminated entirely. The great circular highway system that had been reserved exclusively for Red Ball traffic began accepting other military vehicles during designated hours. The exclusive nature of their mission, the thing that had made them special, was quietly dissolving. Colonel Ross, the transportation officer who had helped organize the Express in its desperate early days, addressed a gathering of drivers at a depot near Chartres. His words were careful, respectful, acknowledging what these men had accomplished. "You've moved over 400,000 tons of supplies," he told them. "You've kept entire divisions fighting when conventional logistics said it was impossible." But the subtext was clear. The emergency phase was ending. More permanent, sustainable supply lines were taking over. The Red Ball Express had succeeded so completely that it was making itself obsolete. The emotional impact varied among the drivers. Some felt genuine relief. The constant pressure, the dangerous night runs, the mechanical breakdowns, the exhaustion. It had taken a toll that many were only beginning to acknowledge. The prospect of regular hours, safer assignments, perhaps even rotation back to the States held obvious appeal. Others experienced something closer to loss. These highways had become their domain. The rhythms of loading, driving, unloading, and returning had created a sense of purpose, unlike anything they'd experienced in the segregated army. Despite the discrimination they still faced, despite the dangers and hardships, the Red Ball Express had given them agency, a chance to directly influence the war's outcome through their skill and determination. Private James Spider Mitchell, the mechanic who had kept impossible trucks running through sheer ingenuity, found himself transferred to a motor pool near Paris. The work was easier, the conditions better, but something essential was missing. In the Red Ball, every repair mattered, he explained to a fellow soldier. Every truck I got running meant supplies reaching the front. Now I'm fixing jeeps for staff officers. The final convoys ran in November 1944. By then, the port of Antwerp was handling massive cargo volumes. Railroad lines damaged during the German occupation had been repaired and were moving supplies efficiently eastward. The emergency that had created the Red Ball Express had been resolved through the very success of the operation itself. There was no formal ceremony, no dramatic final run. The last Red Ball convoy simply completed its delivery and returned to depot, where the trucks were reassigned to conventional transportation companies. The circular highway markers were removed. The exclusive radio frequencies were allocated to other units. The intricate choreography of loading, routing, and scheduling was quietly dismantled. Many of the African American drivers found themselves assigned to service units well behind the advancing front lines. The brief period when their skills and courage had been absolutely essential was over. The Army's institutional prejudices, temporarily suspended by desperate necessity, began reasserting themselves. Combat roles remained largely closed to them. Leadership positions were still rare exceptions rather than normal opportunities. Yet something had changed, subtly but permanently. The Red Ball Express had demonstrated capabilities that could not be entirely ignored or forgotten. French civilians had seen African American soldiers as liberators and heroes. White officers had witnessed competence and dedication that challenged their assumptions. The drivers themselves had experienced a level of responsibility and recognition that would influence their expectations long after the war ended. In quiet moments during the war's final months, former Red Ball drivers would sometimes encounter each other at supply depots or rest areas. They shared a particular understanding, a knowledge of what it meant to keep an entire army supplied through nothing but determination and skill. They remembered the weight of responsibility, the satisfaction of successful deliveries, the camaraderie forged in mechanical crises and midnight runs. The trucks themselves were scattered across the European theater, their Red Ball markings painted over, their specialized equipment removed. But mechanics could still identify them by subtle modifications. Reinforced suspension components, upgraded cooling systems, the particular wear patterns that came from months of maximum utilization. These vehicles had been pushed beyond their design limits and had somehow endured. As winter settled over Europe, the highways that had carried the Red Ball Express returned to normal military traffic. The urgent convoys were replaced by routine supply runs. The dramatic midnight departures gave way to scheduled daylight operations. The crisis logistics that had defined the autumn of 1944 evolved into the steady, predictable supply chains that would sustain the Allied advance into Germany. But in the memories of the men who had driven those highways, in the gratitude of French villagers, in the tactical reports that documented their achievements, the Red Ball Express lived on. They had proven that when democracy's survival was at stake, extraordinary things became possible. When the need was great enough, barriers could be overcome, prejudices could be set aside, and ordinary men could accomplish the impossible. The footsteps were fading now, but their echoes would resonate long after the last truck had returned to depot. Echoes of the road, remembrance and rest. The footsteps were fading now, but their echoes would resonate long after the last truck had returned to depot. In the quiet that followed, something profound settled over the European countryside. A recognition that history had been written not just by generals and politicians, but by men whose names would never appear in the grand narratives, whose faces would fade from official photographs, but whose contributions had altered the very course of human events. Tonight, as we prepare for rest, we might imagine those drivers returning to their barracks after that final run. The familiar weight of exhaustion settling into their shoulders, the satisfaction of another mission completed, mixing with the uncertainty of what would come next. For many, the end of the Red Ball Express meant a return to the segregated realities they had temporarily escaped on those moonlit highways. The democracy they had helped preserve would take decades more to fully embrace them as equals. Yet something had changed during those 81 days of constant motion. In the cab of a GMC truck, racing through the French countryside with a load of ammunition or medical supplies, the color of a man's skin had mattered less than his skill at the wheel. His courage in the face of danger, his commitment to the mission that bound them all together. The road had been a place of temporary equality, where merit was measured in miles covered and supplies delivered, where respect was earned through competence and reliability. The mechanics who had worked their miracles with salvaged parts and improvised solutions, they too had proven something important about human ingenuity and determination. When conventional methods failed, when the supply chain broke down, when the impossible became necessary, they had found ways to keep the wheels turning. Their workshops had become laboratories of innovation, their toolboxes repositories of hope. In those pre-dawn hours, when engines refused to start and deadlines loomed, they had discovered that problems existed to be solved, that limitations were simply invitations to creativity. The French villagers who had watched them work, who had seen these young Americans transform broken machinery into functioning miracles. They understood they were witnessing something beyond mere mechanical repair. They were seeing the American spirit of ingenuity applied to the cause of liberation. And what of those French civilians who had lined the roads with their quiet gratitude, their offerings of bread and wine and simple human kindness? They had recognized in these drivers something that transcended nationality and race, the universal bond between people who risk themselves for others. The elderly farmers who had waved from their fields, the children who had run alongside the trucks, the women who had pressed flowers into dusty hands. They had understood that freedom was being delivered not just in crates and barrels, but in the very act of service itself. The language barriers had dissolved in the face of shared purpose. A smile needed no translation. A helping hand spoke every language. The sight of supplies arriving just when hope was fading. This was a conversation between hearts, not words. In those moments of connection, the true meaning of liberation revealed itself, not as conquest, but as the restoration of human dignity and possibility. The supply depots with their mountains of material and their choreographed efficiency, they too had been more than mere logistical achievements. They had been demonstrations of what became possible when individual efforts aligned toward a common goal. Every clerk who had checked a manifest, every loader who had positioned a crate, every dispatcher who had coordinated a convoy, each had been an essential note in a vast symphony of purpose. The statistics were staggering. The tonnages delivered, the miles covered, the schedules maintained against impossible odds. But behind every number was a human story. A moment of decision when someone chose duty over comfort, mission over safety, collective need over personal convenience. The depot workers who had labored through the night, the planners who had solved logistical puzzles that would have challenged peacetime corporations. They had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough and the purpose clear enough. As the Red Ball Express wound down and the drivers prepared for whatever assignments awaited them next, many must have wondered whether the bonds they had forged would survive the return to conventional military hierarchy. Would the respect they had earned on the highways of France translate into opportunity back home? Would the skills they had developed, the leadership they had demonstrated, the courage they had shown, would any of it matter in a society still struggling with its own contradictions about equality and justice? Some would return to the segregated South, where the uniform that had represented liberation in Europe would offer little protection against familiar prejudices. Others would settle in northern cities, carrying with them the knowledge that they had played a crucial role in democracy's greatest victory. All would carry the memory of those nights when they had been not just drivers or mechanics or supply clerks, but essential participants in the struggle between freedom and tyranny. The trucks themselves would be redistributed, repurposed, eventually scrapped or sold as surplus. The GMC-CCKWs that had been the workhorses of liberation would find new lives in construction companies and freight hauling, their wartime service remembered only in the occasional dent or scratch that spoke of harder days. But for a brief moment in history, they had been more than vehicles. They had been instruments of hope, carriers of possibility, symbols of what could be accomplished when determination met necessity. The roads they had traveled would return to peaceful purposes. Farmers bringing crops to market, families visiting distant relatives, children walking to schools that were slowly being rebuilt. But the asphalt and gravel would remember the weight of those loaded trucks, the urgency of those midnight runs, the sound of engines straining against time and distance to deliver what was needed where it was needed most. Tonight, as we settle into the comfort of our beds, we might offer a moment of gratitude for those who traveled uncomfortable roads so that we might know peaceful nights. The Red Ball Express drivers who fought sleep to maintain their schedules, the mechanics who worked through exhaustion to keep the convoy moving, the depot workers who labored in anonymity to ensure that supplies reached the front lines, all had sacrificed their rest so that future generations might sleep securely. Their legacy lives not just in the history books that finally began to acknowledge their contributions, but in the principle they embodied. That service to something greater than oneself is the highest calling, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they unite around a common purpose, that the content of character matters more than the color of skin or the accident of birth. The echoes of their truck engines have long since faded from the French countryside, but the echo of their example continues to resonate. In every act of service that puts collective need above personal comfort, in every moment when someone chooses to do what is right rather than what is easy, in every instance when barriers are overcome through determination and courage rather than surrendered to through resignation and fear. As sleep approaches and our own day's efforts settle into memory, we can rest knowing that we are part of a continuum, that the same capacity for service and sacrifice that drove those trucks through the dangerous nights of 1944 lives on in each generation, waiting to be called upon when the need is great and the cause is just, ready to prove once again that when democracy's survival is at stake, when freedom hangs in the balance, when the future depends on the courage of ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things, the road forward always appears, illuminated by the headlights of hope and traveled by those who refuse to let the darkness win.